To understand the magnitude of what Yeager achieved, we have to look at the scoreboard in late 1943, and the numbers were absolutely devastating. By that December, the United States Army Air Forces weren't just losing, they were facing a crisis that threatened to halt the entire strategic bombing campaign over Europe. The statistics from the raid logs tell a grim story. During the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids back in August, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. That is 600 men, pilots, navigators, gunners, killed or marched into POW camps before dinner time. Then in October, they went back to Schweinfurt and lost another 62 aircraft. The math simply didn't work. The loss rates on these deep penetration missions exceeded 20%. If you were a bomber crewman required to fly a 25-mission tour to go home, and the loss rate was 20% per mission, you were essentially a dead man walking. Statistically, you had virtually no chance of surviving your tour. The problem, as everyone understood it at the time, was range. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings were rugged planes, but they drank fuel like water. They could escort the bombers to the German border, but that was it. Once those escorts turned back for England, the Luftwaffe fighters would swarm the unescorted bomber formations like wolves tearing into wounded prey. The obvious solution was engineering. North American Aviation delivered the P-51 Mustang, a fighter with the legs to fly all the way to Berlin and back. But simply having a plane that could reach the fight didn't solve the second, more insidious problem. The real killer wasn't just fuel capacity, it was American fighter doctrine itself. The tactics manual in 1943 was a relic, written by senior officers who had learned to fly in the 1920s, an era of biplanes and air shows. These commanders emphasized rigid formation flying and coordinated attacks. The logic was drawn from naval warfare: stay together, concentrate fire, and survive. Fighter pilots were taught that discipline was paramount. You maintained strict positioning, executed textbook maneuvers, and never, under any circumstances, broke formation to pursue a target individually. Individual initiative wasn't just discouraged, it was treated as a dangerous breach of discipline. While American pilots were being court-martialed for breaking formation, the Luftwaffe were destroying them using a completely different philosophy. The Luftwaffe had spent years refining their doctrine in the Spanish Civil War and on the Eastern Front against Russia. They didn't care about looking pretty in a parade formation. Their doctrine emphasized aggressive individual initiative. German aces like Adolf Galland had developed loose, flexible tactics like the Finger Four formation and energy fighting, tactics that allowed them to dictate the terms of the engagement. The discrepancy in results was horrifying. In late 1943, experienced Luftwaffe pilots were averaging 3 to 4 kills for every single aircraft they lost. Some of their top aces, men like Egon Meyer and Walter Novotny, were operating with kill ratios exceeding 10 to 1. American commanders read the after-action reports. They saw that their pilots were consistently being outmaneuvered, despite flying planes that were technically comparable or even superior. But because the senior leadership was wedded to the manual, they drew the wrong conclusions. They didn't think the tactics were bad, they thought the pilots just needed more discipline. The consensus at headquarters was that the men needed to fly tighter formations and adhere even more strictly to the rules. They were doubling down on a losing hand, convinced that the problem was execution rather than the strategy itself. This was the meat grinder that Chuck Yeager flew into. A system designed by men who hadn't flown in combat in 20 years, pitted against an enemy who had turned air combat into a science.
To understand why a 19-year-old mechanic had to break the rules, you first have to understand that the rules were already failing. By the freezing winter of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces faced a crisis that threatened to dismantle the entire strategic bombing campaign over Europe. The commanders called it a challenge, but the air crews called it a slaughter. The numbers were undeniable and devastating. During the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids in August 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single afternoon. That is 600 men, pilots, navigators, gunners, erased from the roster between breakfast and dinner. In October, a second raid on Schweinfurt cost another 62 bombers. The mathematics of survival had collapsed. The loss rate on these deep penetration missions exceeded 20%. For a bomber crewman required to fly a 25-mission tour to earn their ticket home, the statistics were grim. At a 20% loss rate per mission, surviving all 25 was virtually impossible. The primary culprit was a gap in range. The escort fighters of the day, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, were formidable machines, but they lacked the fuel capacity to follow the bombers deep into the Reich. They could shepherd the big friends to the German border, but then they had to turn back. That moment, when the escorts banked for England and the bombers flew on alone, was when the killing started. Luftwaffe fighters would swarm the defenseless formations like wolves on wounded prey. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang should have solved this. North American aviation had delivered a miracle, a fighter with the range to fly all the way to Berlin and back. But while the engineers had solved the fuel problem, a more insidious problem remained in the cockpit. American fighter doctrine was fundamentally flawed. The tactics manual, the gospel that every pilot was trained on, had been written by senior officers who learned their trade in the 1920s. These were men who viewed air combat through the lens of World War I dogfights and air show precision. The manual emphasized rigid formation flying and coordinated attacks above all else. Pilots were taught to maintain strict positioning, execute textbook maneuvers, and never break formation discipline. Individual initiative wasn't just discouraged, it was viewed as a dangerous breakdown of order. This defensive, rigid mindset was colliding with a German force that had turned air combat into a fluid, aggressive science. The Luftwaffe doctrine had been refined in the fires of real combat over Spain, Poland, France, and Russia. They didn't care about parade ground formations. German aces like Adolf Galland had developed the finger four formation and energy fighting tactics that prioritized speed, altitude, and the element of surprise. They emphasized aggressive individual initiative, allowing their pilots to break formation and hunt.
The results were catastrophic for the Americans. In late 1943, experienced Luftwaffe pilots were averaging 3 to 4 kills for every aircraft they lost. Some aces, like Egon Mayer and Walter Novotny, were achieving kill ratios exceeding 10 to 1. American commanders knew something was wrong. After-action reports consistently showed their pilots being outmaneuvered despite flying aircraft with comparable or superior performance. But the leadership drew the wrong conclusion. They believed the solution was more discipline, not less. They ordered stricter adherence to the manual and more formation training. The consensus among the senior brass was that the tactics were sound and the problem was simply poor execution. They were sending young men to their deaths armed with a rulebook that was obsolete the moment the first shot was fired. This was the deadly stalemate that existed until an uneducated kid from West Virginia decided to ignore the manual and listen to his gut. Charles Elwood Yeager was never supposed to be in the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang. In the stratified world of the 1940s military, he was the wrong kind of man for the job. While the Army Air Forces recruited pilots from the Ivy League and the country clubs, looking for young men with college degrees and impeccable social standing, Yeager was growing up in the hardscrabble foothills of Hamlin, West Virginia during the Great Depression. His family was poor. His father worked the coal mines and natural gas fields, and Chuck spent his youth hunting squirrels and rabbits just to put meat on the dinner table. It was these woods, not a classroom, that gave Yeager his first and most critical flight training. To eat, he had to be fast, precise, and patient. He developed hand-eye coordination that bordered on the supernatural and eyesight that was simply off the charts. Yeager could spot a squirrel frozen in a tree at 300 yards. Later, flight surgeons would measure his vision at 20/10, twice as acute as a normal human being. But in 1941, the Army didn't care about his eyes, they cared about his lack of a diploma. When he enlisted in September 1941, it wasn't to fly planes, but to grease them. He was assigned as an aircraft mechanic, a grease monkey, working on P-39 era Cobras in Nevada. Fate intervened in July 1942. The war was chewing up pilots faster than the training pipeline could replace them. Desperate for bodies, the Army Air Forces launched the Flying Sergeant program, a rare initiative that allowed enlisted men with only a high school education to train as pilots. Yeager volunteered immediately. His superiors were skeptical. They looked at his marginal educational background and his rough Appalachian demeanor and doubted he had the intellectual capacity for the split-second spatial reasoning required in air combat. He proved them wrong the moment he touched the stick. At flight school, while the college boys overthought the aerodynamics, Yeager flew by feel. He possessed a natural affinity for machinery and motion that no textbook could teach. By November 1943, when he arrived in England, assigned to the 363rd Fighter Squadron, the cultural divide was stark.
Most of his squadron mates were officers with degrees and polished manners. Some even had private pilot licenses from before the war. Yeager was the kid with the thick drawl who lacked social polish, the outsider in the officers' mess. But he had something they didn't. He had the instincts of a hunter. He painted the name Glamorous Glennis on the nose of his P-51B, named after his girlfriend back home, and prepared to face the Luftwaffe. He didn't know the physics equations, but he knew how to kill prey that was trying to kill him. And on his 8th mission, that instinct would be the only thing standing between him and a fiery death. On December 20th, 1943, the sky over Bremen, Germany became the laboratory for a physics experiment that Chuck Yeager never intended to conduct. The situation was desperate. Yeager was flying Glamorous Glenn, his P-51B Mustang, on only his 8th combat mission. The 19-year-old was exhausted, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the stick, and his aircraft was critically low on resources. His fuel gauge was dropping toward empty, and the ammunition counter indicated he had only 60 rounds remaining. To make matters worse, he had a Messerschmitt Bf-109 glued to his tail, flown by a veteran ace named Ludwig Francisette, a pilot with 11 confirmed kills who had been hunting Allied flyers for 2 years. The German pilot had already positioned himself for the killing shot. Cannon shells were ripping past Yeager's canopy, and the seasoned hunter was closing in for a deflection shot designed to shred the Mustang's engine. Yeager's training, the doctrine drilled into him by the Army Air Forces, screamed a specific set of instructions: maintain altitude, execute a standard evasive turn, and try to reach friendly aircraft. The logic was sound on paper. Altitude was life, and staying high gave the Mustang its best performance advantages. But Yeager's survival instinct overrode the manual. Instead of turning, he did something that seemed functionally insane. He rolled the Mustang inverted and pulled the stick back, diving nearly vertically toward the German countryside, sitting 7,000 feet below. By every conventional metric of 1943 aviation, this was suicide. It was common knowledge among Allied pilots that you did not dive away from a Messerschmitt. The German Bf-109 utilized a fuel-injected engine, which allowed it to perform negative G maneuvers without the engine cutting out. American fighters, which used carburetors, would often sputter or stall under similar stress. Furthermore, the German airframes were legendary for their diving performance. Doctrine explicitly discouraged diving away from enemy fighters because the math said the German plane would catch you, or the ground would. But Yeager wasn't calculating math, he was reacting like a West Virginia hunter, using the terrain and every scrap of speed available to escape a predator. As Glamorous Glenn screamed toward the deck, the airspeed indicator spun past 400 miles per hour, then 450. The aircraft began to buffet violently as it approached the structural limits of its airframe. The dive angle was so steep that Yeager's vision began to gray out from the intense G-forces. But then, something unexpected happened, a quirk of engineering that the manual hadn't accounted for. The Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engine, equipped with a 2-stage supercharger, began to perform differently than anyone expected at these extreme speeds and lower altitudes. As Yeager pushed the throttle through the gate, the Mustang didn't just fall, it accelerated, screaming past 500 miles per hour.
The controls felt locked solid from the immense aerodynamic pressure, like they were welded in place. Behind him, Francisette was firing repeatedly, but the geometry of the fight was changing rapidly. The German rounds were falling behind the Mustang. Yeager was pulling away. The American fighter was slicing through the air with less drag and more power than the German aircraft could match in that specific envelope. At 1,500 feet, with the ground rushing up to meet him at nearly the speed of sound, Yeager hauled back on the stick with both hams. The G-forces slammed him into his seat, tunneling his vision. The wings of the Mustang flexed upward, stressed nearly to the point of catastrophic failure. The aircraft bottomed out at a terrifying 800 feet, traveling at 480 miles per hour, leveling off just above the treetops. The German ace tried to follow the maneuver, confident in his aircraft's superiority. The Bf-109 pulled out at 600 feet, but the violence of the maneuver bled off the German's energy drastically. His airspeed dropped to 320 miles per hour as he fought to regain level flight. When Yeager leveled out and looked back, he saw a sight that shouldn't have been possible. The German fighter that had been seconds away from killing him was now behind him in terms of position, but essentially stationary in the air relative to Yeager's preserved momentum. The hunter had become slow and vulnerable. desperately trying to regain speed and altitude. Jaeger didn't hesitate. He reversed his course, climbed slightly to convert his massive speed into altitude, and slid in behind the Bf-109. At 400 yards, Jaeger squeezed the trigger for a 3-second burst. The .5 caliber rounds tore into the German fighter's wing root and fuselage. The Bf-109 rolled left, trailing smoke, and spiraled into the ground. In the span of roughly 60 seconds, a terrified teenager had inadvertently executed the first recorded high-speed yo-yo maneuver in combat history. He didn't know the name of the move. He didn't understand the aerodynamics of energy retention that he had just exploited. He just knew that he had broken every rule in the book and survived. When he landed at RAF Leiston and reported the engagement, his squadron commander told him it was absolutely impossible, insisting that the Bf-109 outperformed the Mustang in every dive scenario. But the gun camera footage, though chaotic, couldn't be argued with. Jaeger had found the Mustang's hidden gear. When Chuck Yeager climbed out of Glamorous Glen at RAF Leiston, shaking from the adrenaline of his high-speed escape, he likely expected a debriefing. What he got instead was an interrogation. When he reported the engagement, specifically the part where he outdove a Bf-109 and then used the speed to zoom back up behind it, the reaction from his squadron commander was immediate and dismissive. That is absolutely impossible. In the sterile safety of the briefing room, far removed from the violent physics of the dogfight, the intelligence officers and senior pilots picked apart his story. They told him he must have misidentified the enemy aircraft. They claimed the gun camera footage was inconclusive because the dive was too violent for the mechanism to track properly. The consensus was patronizing but firm. Jaeger was a green kid from Appalachia who had experienced the fog of war. His memory was confused by combat stress. The skepticism wasn't just personal, it was institutional. Major Thomas Hayes, the group operations officer, laid out the technical reality as the Army Air Forces understood it. You cannot outdive a measurement. This was considered an established scientific fact. The German fighters utilized advanced fuel injection systems that allowed them to push negative Gs without starving the engine. The American P-51s relied on carburetors, which were prone to cutting out under similar stress. To the senior officers, many of whom had learned to fly in the 1920s, Jaeger's claim wasn't just unlikely, it was physical heresy. The Doctrine explicitly forbade diving away from enemy fighters for this very reason. Jaeger was describing a maneuver that violated the fundamental principles taught at the Air Corps Tactical School.
But the problem with established fact is that it often fails to account for the anomalies of war. Over the next 3 weeks, the cracks in the official dogma began to widen. Other pilots, like Lieutenant William Wisner, returned from missions with similar impossible stories. Wisner reported executing a near-vertical dive to escape 2 Focke-Wulf 190s, only to discover that at extreme terminal velocities, the Mustang's handling characteristics transformed. The reports caught the attention of Captain Don Blakesley, the commander of the 4th Fighter Group. Blakesley was no rookie. He was one of the most experienced American pilots in the European theater. He suspected that the Academy theory was missing something that was happening in the chaotic reality of the stratosphere. On January 11, 1944, Blakesley decided to settle the argument the hard way. He took a P-51B up to 25,000 feet over the English Channel and deliberately executed a series of high-speed dive tests to push the airframe to its breaking point. The data he brought back was startling. Blakesley discovered that while the German planes had the advantage at the start of a dive, the Mustang's handling characteristics changed below 20,000 feet. In dives exceeding 450 miles per hour, the Mustang actually accelerated faster than any German fighter in the sky. The 2-stage supercharger, designed primarily for high-altitude performance, was creating unexpected power advantages at high speeds and lower altitudes. Blakesley compiled his findings into a detailed report and walked into a commander's meeting on January 18, 1944, ready to challenge the entire establishment. The reaction was hostile. The room erupted. These were colonels and generals who had built their careers on the existing system. They were now being told that their fundamental assumptions about fighter combat were wrong, and worse, that a teenage mechanic from West Virginia had figured it out before they did.
Colonel Hubert Zemke, the legendary commander of the 56th Fighter Group, was appalled. "This is reckless cowboy flying," he argued. "We cannot abandon coordinated tactics for individual heroics. That's what gets pilots killed." Another colonel slammed the table, insisting that physics doesn't lie, reiterating the fuel injection argument. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood the book, the safe, coordinated, formation-based doctrine that protected careers but killed pilots. On the other side stood the cowboys, men like Yeager and Blakesley, who argued that the chaotic reality of 1944 demanded a new set of rules. The meeting threatened to end with Blakesley's report being filed away in a dark cabinet, buried by bureaucratic inertia. Changing the doctrine would require the Army to admit it had been wrong, and in the military, that is often the hardest maneuver of all. The survival of thousands of bomber crews now hung on whether a single general would have the courage to overrule his own staff. The meeting on January 18, 1944 was teetering on the edge of failure. The room was thick with the smoke of cigars and the heavy weight of tradition. The colonels and staff officers were ready to bury Captain Blakesley's report, dismissing the data as an anomaly and the tactics as reckless insubordination. The bureaucratic inertia was enormous. To accept the report was to admit that the Army Air Forces had been training its pilots wrong for years. Then, a voice cut through the noise. It belonged to Major General William Kepner, the commander of the 8th Fighter Command.
Kepner was a maverick in a room full of managers. He wasn't a product of the modern academy. He had learned to fly in 1916 and had flown combat missions over the trenches of World War I. He had seen too many young men die because they followed orders that didn't match reality. While the other officers worried about formation, discipline, and doctrine, Kepner was looking at a different metric: survival. He stood up and silenced the room with a statement that would define his command. "Gentlemen, I don't care if this contradicts everything we learned at tactical school. I care about kill ratios." Kepner pointed out the uncomfortable truth that the staff officers were trying to ignore. Captain Blakesley's group, the ones flying like cowboys, had the highest success rate in the theater. If his pilots are surviving by breaking the rules, Kepner argued, then maybe our rules are wrong. He didn't wait for a consensus. He used his authority to order immediate, rigorous testing of the Mustang's dive profile. Over the next 2 weeks, test pilots took the P-51B to its absolute limits, replicating the suicide maneuvers that Yeager and Wisner had survived. The results were undeniable. The data confirmed exactly what the 19-year-old from West Virginia had felt in his gut. At speeds above 450 miles per hour, the Mustang's acceleration in a dive was superior to both the BF-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. The physics held up. The book was wrong. On February 3, 1944, General Kepner issued a revolutionary directive that shattered 20 years of aviation dogma. The order was simple but devastatingly effective. It authorized fighter pilots to use individual initiative and aggressive tactics, explicitly permitting the high-speed diving attacks that had previously been forbidden. The directive went further. It formally de-emphasized the rigid formation discipline that had shackled American pilots. Instead of being flying bodyguards tethered to the bombers, Mustang pilots were now encouraged to exploit their aircraft's high-speed performance to hunt. The old guard was appalled. They viewed this as the legalization of chaos, but Kepner held firm. With the stroke of a pen, the leash was taken off the P-51 Mustang. The hidden monster of the American arsenal, the ability to outdive and out-energy the Luftwaffe, was no longer a court-martial offense. It was now standard operating procedure. The American pilots weren't just escorts anymore. They were authorized predators. And the Luftwaffe, confident in their superior tactics, had no idea that the rules of the game had just changed overnight. The theoretical debate ended on February 20, 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched Big Week, a massive campaign designed to break the back of the German aircraft industry. For the first time, over 1,000 bombers streamed toward targets deep inside the Reich, escorted by Mustangs flying under General Kepner's new aggressive rules. The impact was immediate and violent. On March 3, 1944, the skies over Berlin became the stage for the definitive proof of concept. Chuck Yeager, now an ace with 12 kills, was leading a flight of 4 Mustangs at 28,000 feet. Below them, Oberleutnant Heinz Baer, a legendary German ace with over 170 confirmed kills, was leading a swarm of Bf-109s in a climbing attack. In 1943, standard doctrine would have dictated that Yeager maintain a defensive posture. But Yeager wasn't defending anymore. He spotted the Germans 30 seconds before they saw him. Instead of holding formation, he did something that would have been forbidden just 3 months prior. He rolled inverted and dove toward the enemy fighters. As his Mustang screamed past 600 miles per hour, the controls stiffened like they were welded solid. The German pilots, focused on the bombers, assumed the diving Americans were fleeing. They were wrong. Yeager used his massive kinetic energy to pull up underneath the German formation. The Bf-109s, climbing at a sluggish 380 miles per hour, were sitting ducks. Yeager fired a 2-second burst, vaporizing the trailing fighter, while his wingman, Bud Anderson, took down Baer's wingman. The entire engagement lasted 45 seconds. 2 German fighters destroyed, 0 American losses. This scene repeated itself across the European theater. The kill ratios tell the story of a slaughter. In January 1944, before the tactical shift, the exchange ratio was 2.1 to 1. By June, after widespread adoption of energy tactics, it skyrocketed to 6.1 to 1. The Luftwaffe pilots realized the game was over. Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran ace, wrote in his diary, "The American fighters have changed. They dive from impossible altitudes at terrifying speeds. Our fuel-injected engines, which gave us such advantages, no longer matter." The predator had become the prey. The American pilots weren't just escorting bombers, they were depopulating the Luftwaffe of its experienced veterans. By the summer of 1944, bomber loss rates dropped from the catastrophic 20% of the previous winter to less than 4%. The manual had been rewritten in the sky, and the impossible maneuver of a West Virginia teenager had broken the back of the German Air Force. Chuck Yeager survived the war to become a legend. He finished his tour with 11.5 confirmed kills, was shot down in France, escaped with the help of the resistance, and successfully petitioned Eisenhower to return to combat. But his war record was just the prologue. On October 14, 1947, flying the Bell X-1, Yeager became the first human to break the sound barrier. The specific skills required to control an aircraft at Mach 1, precise energy management and aggressive high-speed control, were the exact same instincts he had honed while diving away from Bf-109s over Germany. Yeager retired as a brigadier general in 1975, but he never claimed to be a tactical genius. In his autobiography, he wrote with characteristic bluntness, "I was just trying not to die. If that helped other pilots survive, I'm grateful. But I didn't figure anything out. I just reacted." Yet that reaction became the foundation of American air power. The energy fighting tactics that Yeager accidentally pioneered and General Kepner authorized are still the bedrock of air combat training today. Every cadet in the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps spends their first weeks learning to trade altitude for speed, the very concept that was once considered impossible by the experts of 1943. The lesson of December 20th, 1943 extends far beyond the cockpit. It is a reminder that true innovation rarely comes from committee meetings or carefully written rulebooks. It comes from the outsiders, the 19-year-old mechanics from West Virginia who are too desperate to care about doctrine and too inexperienced to know what is supposed to be impossible. Sometimes the only way to win is to realize that the rules were written by people who never had a Messerschmitt on their tail.